when Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, ending the Civil War. There was one witness to that historic moment who couldn't comprehend what had just happened. A gray horse named Traveler, who had carried Lee through every major battle of the war, stood quietly as his rider signed away the Confederate cause. But what happened to this famous horse after the war is a story most people don't know. And what they think they know is only half the truth. Most history books will tell you that Traveler lived peacefully with Lee until 1871, then died from tetanus. The end, but that's not the full story. What really happened to Traveler after his death is shocking, disturbing, and reveals how America struggled to deal with the symbols of the Confederacy in the years following the war. Today, we're uncovering the truth about what happened to America's most famous Civil War horse. And I promise you, the real story is far stranger and more controversial than anything you've been told. To understand why Traveler's fate matters, you first need to understand what he meant to Robert E. Lee. This wasn't just a general and his horse. This was one of the most intense human-animal bonds in American military history. Lee purchased Traveler in February 1862 for $200 Confederate dollars, which would be about $6,500 today. The horse's original name was Jeff Davis, named after the Confederate president, but Lee renamed him Traveler, spelling it with two L's in the British fashion. Lee described Traveler in a letter to his wife's cousin with remarkable detail and affection, praising his fine proportions, muscular figure, deep chest, short back, strong haunches, flat legs, small head, broad forehead, delicate ears, quick eye, and small feet with black mane and tail. He wrote that such a picture would inspire a poet to depict the horse's endurance of toil, hunger, thirst, heat, and cold, and the dangers and suffering they had endured together. But here's what made their bond extraordinary. Traveler wasn't an easy horse. He was high-strung, nervous, spirited, and generally on edge most of the time. Most officers would have replaced him with a calmer mount, but Lee loved him precisely because of his spirit. During the Second Battle of Bull Run, while Lee was reconnoitering on foot and holding Traveler's bridle, the horse became frightened and plunged, pulling Lee down onto a stump and breaking both his hands. Lee spent the rest of that campaign in an ambulance with a courier leading Traveler. Most generals would have shot a horse for that. Lee forgave him and kept riding him. For 3 years, Lee and Traveler were inseparable. They rode through Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg. On at least 6 occasions during the 1864 Overland Campaign, Confederate soldiers had to physically grab Traveler's reins to prevent Lee from leading charges personally, shouting, "Lee to the rear." The most famous incident occurred in the Wilderness on May 6, 1864, when the Texas Brigade surrounded Traveler and refused to advance until Lee moved to safety. After that exhausting day, Lee dismounted and was so overcome that he threw his arms around Traveler's neck just to hold himself up. That's not the relationship between a man and a tool. That's love. On April 9, 1865, Lee rode Traveler to Appomattox Court House to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant. In one of history's most famous acts of military courtesy, Grant allowed Confederate soldiers to keep their horses, understanding they would need them for spring planting. It was a generous gesture, and it saved Traveler from becoming a Union war trophy. But it also meant that Traveler, unlike thousands of other Confederate horses, survived the war intact and would follow Lee into civilian life. After the surrender, Lee rode Traveler back to Richmond, then eventually to Lexington, Virginia, where Lee had accepted the presidency of Washington College, a small struggling institution that would later be renamed Washington and Lee University. For the next 5 years, from 1865 to 1870, Traveler lived on the college campus, where he became almost as famous as his owner. Students and veterans would travel for miles just to see the legendary Confederate gray, but fame came with a price. Admirers constantly plucked hairs from Traveler's tail as souvenirs, both college students and veterans wanting a piece of the famous horse and his even more famous general. Lee wrote to his daughter Mildred with frustration, saying, "The boys are plucking out his tail. and he is presenting the appearance of a plucked chicken. Imagine being so famous that people are literally pulling your hair out. Traveler endured this indignity with the same patience he'd shown under artillery fire. Lee tried to protect him, but there was only so much he could do. During these years, one of Lee's greatest pleasures was taking afternoon rides on Traveler around Lexington. His daughter Mildred would accompany him on another horse, Lucy Long. These peaceful rides stood in stark contrast to the wartime miles they'd covered together. After one particularly exhausting day during the war, Lee had dismounted and thrown his arms around Traveler's neck to hold himself up. Now they rode in peace, two aging warriors enjoying quiet companionship in the Virginia countryside. On October 12, 1870, Robert E. Lee died of complications from a stroke. He was 63 years old. During Lee's funeral procession, Traveler was led behind the caisson bearing the general's casket, with his saddle and bridle draped in black crepe. Thousands lined the streets of Lexington to watch the procession, and leading it right behind the hearse was Traveler, stepping proudly as he had through so many campaigns. It was fitting. Lee's family and colleagues understood that Traveler wasn't just a horse. He was Lee's companion, his partner, his friend. No one thought it strange that a horse took precedence over human dignitaries in the funeral procession. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Only 6 months after Lee's death, in June 1871, Traveler stepped on a rusty nail. It seemed like a minor injury, the kind of thing horses deal with regularly. But this was 1871, before antibiotics, before modern veterinary medicine. Traveler developed tetanus and there was no cure. Tetanus is a horrific way to die. The bacterial infection causes muscle spasms so severe they can break bones. The victim remains conscious throughout, fully aware as their body locks up and breathing becomes impossible. The Lee family faced an agonizing decision. Traveler, who had survived countless battles, who had carried Lee through 3 years of war, was dying slowly and painfully from stepping on a nail in peacetime. There was only one merciful choice. Traveler was shot to end his suffering. He was 14 years old. In human terms, this was like losing a middle-aged companion in the prime of life. He should have had another decade or more ahead of him. The loss devastated Lee's family and the Washington College community. This wasn't just the death of a horse. This was the end of a living connection to Robert E. Lee, to the war, to a chapter of American history that people were still trying to understand and process. Traveler was initially buried behind the main buildings of the college, in a quiet grave where he could rest near where his master was interred inside the Lee Chapel. It seemed like a dignified end to a remarkable story. But it wasn't the end. Not even close. Here's where the story becomes genuinely disturbing. Traveler's grave was secretly dug up by unknown persons, and his bones were exhumed. We don't know who did it. We don't know exactly when it happened, though it was sometime between 1871 and 1875. What we do know is what happened next. And it's shocking. Traveler's bones were bleached, presumably cleaned and prepared for display, then exhibited in Rochester, New York, in 1875 and 1876. Think about what that means. Someone dug up Robert E. Lee's beloved horse, processed his skeleton like a museum specimen, and put him on public display in a northern city. This wasn't done with the Lee family's permission. This wasn't done with Washington College's blessing. This was grave robbery, pure and simple, motivated by either profit or a twisted desire to possess a piece of Confederate history. Why Rochester, New York? We can only speculate. Rochester was a major center of abolitionism before the war. Frederick Douglass published his newspaper there. It was about as anti-Confederate as the city could be. Was exhibiting Traveler's skeleton some kind of victory trophy? A way of saying, we not only defeated you, we own even your symbols? Or was it simply opportunistic showmanship, capitalizing on public curiosity about the famous horse? The historical record doesn't tell us the motivations, but the act itself speaks volumes about how Americans in the 1870s were struggling with Civil War memory. The exhibition apparently drew crowds. People paid money to see Traveler's bones, to stand before the skeleton of the horse that had carried Lee through Gettysburg and Appomattox. It's ghoulish when you think about it. But it also reveals something about the power of symbols. Traveler wasn't just bones. He was a living connection to recent history, to battles that had killed 600,000 Americans, to questions about honor, defeat, and national identity that the country was nowhere near resolving. The exhibition in Rochester eventually ended, but Traveler's bones remained in the North for decades. Then, in 1907, more than 35 years after his death, something remarkable happened. Richmond journalist Joseph Bryan paid to have Traveler's bones properly mounted and returned to Washington and Lee University. Bryan understood that Traveler belonged with Lee, that separating them was wrong regardless of what one thought about the Confederacy. The skeleton was brought back to Lexington and displayed in the Brooks Museum, in what is now Robinson Hall on the Washington and Lee campus. Finally, Traveler was home. But home turned out to be more complicated than anyone anticipated. The skeleton was periodically vandalized by students who carved their initials into Traveler's bones for good luck. Read that again. Students at Washington and Lee University, the institution that Lee had saved from financial ruin, were defacing his horse's skeleton. This wasn't malicious. In their minds, touching Traveler's bones brought good luck, the same way plucking hairs from his tail had been considered lucky when he was alive. But the cumulative effect was devastating. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of students over the years carved their names, their initials, fraternity symbols into Traveler's bones. They were literally destroying the skeleton through their veneration. It's one of the strangest examples in American history of respect transforming into desecration. In 1929, recognizing the deterioration, the bones were moved to the museum in the basement of Lee Chapel, where they stood for 30 years. But even there, protected from student vandalism, the bones continued to deteriorate. Without proper preservation techniques, exposed to humidity and temperature fluctuations, Traveler's skeleton was slowly crumbling. By the 1960s, the bones that had carried Lee through the Civil War were literally falling apart. Finally, in 1971, exactly 100 years after Traveler's death, his remains were buried properly for the last time in a wooden box encased in concrete next to Lee Chapel on the Washington and Lee campus, just a few feet from where Robert E. Lee's body rests in the family crypt inside. After 100 years of indignity, grave robbery, exhibition, vandalism, and deterioration, Traveler was finally laid to rest with the dignity he deserved. Today, his grave is marked with a simple memorial stone. And here's where the story comes full circle in a way that's both touching and strange. Visitors to Traveler's grave leave coins on the memorial stone. Since they can no longer pluck hair from his tail, they leave pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters as offerings. Children bring apples for a horse that's been dead for over 150 years. On any given day, you'll find fresh coins and occasionally an apple placed on Traveler's grave by visitors who feel compelled to honor this horse they never met. The stable where Traveler lived his last days, directly connected to the Lee House on campus, traditionally stands with its doors left open, said to allow his spirit to wander freely. When one Washington and Lee president tried to close the stable doors, he faced such fierce backlash from the university community that he reopened them and had them painted a special color he called Traveler Green, even in death. Even as a spirit, Traveler apparently has expectations about his accommodations, but the story doesn't end even there. In recent years, as America has wrestled with how to remember the Civil War and Confederate symbols, Traveler has been caught up in larger controversies. Some have called for the removal of his grave marker, arguing that anything associated with Robert E. Lee perpetuates a racist past. Others have defended Traveler as a symbol that transcends the Confederacy, arguing that he was an animal who had no choice in the matter and deserves to be remembered for his own sake, not as a Confederate icon. So what does Traveler's story really tell us? On one level, it's a story about how difficult Americans have found it to process the Civil War. Union General Carter wrote that the sight of General Lee and his splendid war horse was a graven image in the heart of every red-blooded soldier, no matter under which flag he fought. Even the enemy recognized something special about Lee and Traveler together. But that recognition didn't prevent Traveler's grave from being robbed, his skeleton from being exhibited in the North, or his bones from being vandalized by successive generations. Traveler's story is also about the power of symbols. He was just a horse. He had no ideology, no political beliefs, no stake in the war beyond following his rider wherever that rider chose to go. Yet he became inseparable from Robert E. Lee's legacy, for better and worse. You can't tell Lee's story without Traveler. And you can't discuss Traveler without confronting difficult questions about what Lee and the Confederacy represented. But there's another way to look at this story. Traveler was, by all accounts, a remarkable horse. He was difficult to frighten in battle, showed great stamina, and developed a deep bond with his rider. He tolerated having his tail plucked bare by souvenir hunters. He forgave Lee for the times when his own fear caused accidents. He carried his rider through some of the most horrific battles in American history and never failed him. That deserves to be remembered on its own terms. In 1988, British author Richard Adams, famous for writing Watership Down, published a novel called Traveler that told the story of the Civil War from the horse's perspective. It's a remarkable book because it strips away all the human politics and ideology and asks a simple question. What would the war have looked like to an intelligent, observant horse who was present for all of it, but understood none of the human reasons behind it? Adams's Traveler is confused by the war, devoted to Marse Robert, and convinced until the end that the Confederacy won. It's a reminder that Traveler himself was an innocent caught up in human conflicts he couldn't comprehend. So what really happened to Robert E. Lee's horse after the Civil War? He lived peacefully for 5 years, served as a living symbol of the Confederate cause, had his tail plucked bare by admirers, led Lee's funeral procession, died horribly from tetanus 6 months later, was buried respectfully, then was secretly exhumed and exhibited in the North. Had his bones brought back south and displayed in a museum where students carved their initials into his skeleton for decades, deteriorated from exposure and vandalism, and was finally reburied properly 100 years after his death. His grave is still visited by people who leave coins and apples for a horse they never met. And his stable doors are left open so his spirit can wander freely. It's a story that encompasses grave robbery, vandalism, Northern triumph, Southern nostalgia, changing attitudes about the Civil War, and the strange ways that Americans have struggled to deal with difficult history. Traveler deserved better. He deserved the peaceful retirement that Lee wanted for him, the dignified rest that he was denied for a century. But in a way, his complicated afterlife is fitting. The Civil War itself has never been laid to rest in American memory. Maybe it's appropriate that the most famous horse of that war has had an equally complicated journey. Today, Traveler rests next to Lee Chapel, finally at peace. His story remains a mirror for how Americans remember, forget, honor, and struggle with their most difficult history. He was just a horse, but he became a symbol of something larger than himself. And that's what really happened to Robert E. Lee's horse after the Civil War. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. In our next video, we'll explore Bucephalus, Alexander the Great's legendary war horse who traveled 11,000 miles across 3 continents. Until then, remember that even in history's darkest chapters, there are stories worth preserving. And sometimes those stories have 4 legs.